means it is a good time to talk to our first guest today. He is Terry Foy. He is the CEO of Inside Lacrosse. And Terry, it's been great to have you on as always. It's been kind of a wild season so far, but feels like it's only picking up steam at this point, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. When you were going through that intro, it just reminded me of the Hemingway quote, gradually and then suddenly, because, there's always such a strong correlation between the weather and where it feels like we are in lacrosse season. And, it got a little warm and sunny in, kind of most of the places that play lacrosse over the last 2 weeks. And then, it got hit with this bout of snow and cold over the last week. And it was like, oh man, it feels like we went all the way back to the beginning of the year. And yet, as you point out, we only have 2 weeks left before the games not only count, but, start to mean that teams pack up their equipment for the rest of the year.
It's snowing today in Syracuse, Terry. So thank you, Terry. But I think the next time the Orange play, it's going to be like 85 or something Saturday in Durham when they head down there. All right. Our favorite question to ask around here about lacrosse is Syracuse back? Where are we at on the is Syracuse back meter at this point of the season heading toward the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I was on the Syracuse who's back last year train. When you and I spoke, I talked about how I felt like they had this very clear line of expectation, which was the quarterfinals. And does that mean they're back by historic standards? No, but it's not history anymore. The types of teams, the number of teams that are competing for national championships is completely different from when you made it to 22 straight Final Fours. And so, I'm not expecting fans to adjust their expectations to that. That's not what fans are supposed to do. But, I felt like making it to the quarterfinals, despite a disappointing exit and end of last season, reflected backness. And I think this team, which, obviously has a core of juniors who were instrumental to not only last year, but also 2 years ago's team's growth and success, they're closer to the end of the road than they are at the beginning. And so the expectations ratchet up a little bit and it becomes a Final Four standard. And that's what this teams, like I said, expectations rightfully are. Are they a favorite to make it to the Final Four right now? I would say no, but they're in that 5 to 8 category pretty clearly, in my opinion, and certainly the win over Notre Dame and loss to Cornell, I think, very, acutely illustrate both of those ends of the spectrum. And all that means is that you just need one good game the third Saturday or Sunday in May, and you're back to the standard of the program. And so, yes, I'm firmly in the camp that Syracuse is back.
Okay, so that is good. Well, what's your read of how they're playing, though? Because you look at the last 2 weeks, and you're right. Like, the Notre Dame game, I'm like, okay, now this version of Syracuse I haven't seen in a hot minute, and then it was just a little wobbly there against Cornell. How do you think the actual ball looks right now?
Not to make this conversation too much about weather, but I feel like the answer to the question is pretty different depending on whether or not they're in the friendly confines of the JMA Wireless Dome. And I think when they're playing at home, it doesn't really matter who the opponent is. They're going to play well, and they're going to show at both ends of the field the combination of fast-paced, intense Syracuse lacrosse. It's the reason that so many folks in Central New York fell in love with this team. But when they're not, there are questions around, kind of, again, both ends of the field. Can they match up with the elite players, right? Sam King earlier in the year, even though obviously that was also in the Dome. And then, more recently, CJ Kirst. And then, can they manufacture goals? And putting up 12 on Cornell's defense is nothing to sneeze at. But if you're allowing 17, it's not enough. And I think that's kind of where the rubber meets the road as far as that's concerned.
Terry Foy, CEO of Inside Lacrosse, is with us. And, Syracuse heads down to Duke this week. And Duke is probably slightly behind where the Orange are right now. But very slightly, Notre Dame's right there. Like the thin line here in lacrosse these days, and this is nothing new this year, between, like the 4 seed or the 5 seed of the tournament and literally missing the playoffs is literally like a game or two. What do you make of this balance of some teams that are literally on the bubble and national championship contenders here at the same time?
Yeah, so let me answer that question in 2 ways. The first is that this type of season is what college sports are, and it's what college lacrosse fans were accustomed to up to 2019. The additional year of eligibility that came after that, I think, created, 21 was weird. There were, leagues that only played themselves, and then 22 was a little weird because the Ivy League came roaring back after not having played in 21. And then 23 and 24 were really marked by a lot of rosters that were, over-indexed on guys that were 22, 23, 24, sometimes 25 years old. And when that's the nature of things, it gets closer to being professional sports. And so, it's less predictable. That's kind of, it's more predictable. It's less unpredictable. It's kind of the nature of pro sports relative to, dealing with 19 to 21-year-olds. So that's the first answer. And then the second answer is this year has produced a lot of resumes that are unusual. Typically, teams that have high RPIs also have high strength of schedules. We have more teams that, are in the single digits in one category and in the teens and 20s in another.
Right.
And so that's why that threshold, Ohio State is probably the best example of it right now. Before they lost to Maryland, they were number 12 in the RPI and number 24 or 5 in strength of schedule, which are the two key metrics, but they were 11-1 and they had a win over Notre Dame on the road. And so anecdotally or subjectively, they were very clearly one of the best teams in the country. But objectively, according to the metrics that the committee uses in order to make their decisions, they were a bubble team. And I think that kind of illustrates the point that you're really getting at. And it's just unusual. There aren't very many seasons where you have that disparity between RPI and strength schedule for a number of teams.
Yeah, no, I mean, go look at the last 2 years, to the beginning of your point, right? Like, Notre Dame was the best team in the country 2 years ago. The only question was, okay, can they finally get over the hump? Last year, it would have been, frankly, shocking if anyone had beaten them in the playoffs, and they steamrolled their way to the national title. That team doesn't exist this year. How big today, mid-April, is your pool of, actual national title contenders?
Yeah, so I would say on a typical year, it's between 3 and 5. And your point is well taken, that Notre Dame had separated themselves from the rest of the group. But at the same time, even a team as good as them can have an off day, and that's always a possibility. This year, I have said for at least a month, I think that there are 9 teams that can win. I think that pool has shrunk maybe down to 7 or 8. So, but that's still double what is usual. And I think, again, it kind of illustrates the last 2 points that we made, because not only is the gap between the best and the next tier narrower, but also what that means, especially when you consider these teams' resumes for the NCAA tournament and how much fluctuation we're going to see over the next 3 weeks, the path really matters. And, in a 64-team basketball tournament, there are a couple of, first and second round matchups that you can kind of take for granted. And then you start to consider what the path looks like maybe when you get to the Sweet 16 and Elite 8. Well, in the men's lacrosse tournament, that's the whole tournament. And so, were you a 1, 2, or 3 seed and you got a pretty favorable first round matchup that maybe allowed you to rest your starters, and then you were able to, convert that into being a 2 to 3 goal favorite in the quarterfinals? Or were you a 4, 5, or 6 seed that had a dogfight in the first round, and then the spread in the quarterfinal was a half a goal or a goal and a half? And so that can be the difference as to whether or not you make it to the Final Four. And then once you do, pretty much everybody is equally good. And so that's the thing about this sport, is getting to the Final Four, the game's biggest stage, and once you get there, it becomes much more of a roll of the dice. Whereas the disparity or difference between those paths in the first 2 rounds is really meaningful.
All right. Speaking of path here, Terry, you know how these tournaments get selected and how, unfortunately, still geography plays into it in the lacrosse bracketing. I know we're a month out. I don't know where the game's going to be. I don't know what the seeds are going to be, but what's your percentage on a Syracuse Army first-round game at this point? It feels like it's just staring us in the face almost regardless of what happens here.
Yeah, so I started working on my most recent bracketology update that's going to come out on InsideLacrosse.com tomorrow. And I think the difference between the first time I did it 2 weeks ago and this iteration is Army's resume has solidified. That win over North Carolina is a top 5 win. Their metrics have not taken a hit. And I don't think that they necessarily project to. I mean, obviously, they still have a game against a Loyola team that I believe is 2-11 at this point. So that's not going to do wonders for their strength of schedule. But that's going to be bolstered a little bit by some games against good teams and teams with good records in the Patriot League tournament. And so I would actually put the percentage chance in the 5 to 15% neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
I think it's pretty slim because I think that it's much more likely that they both get home games than any other alternative.
Okay, because that would be obviously I don't think either team would be rooting for that game in the first round, especially since go figure this is the year they did not play in the regular season, so you can connect the dots there. But yeah, if they both have home games, then they clearly can't play each other in the first round. As we got Terry.
How about we make it a semifinal?
Yeah, that's cool. That means you're in the Final Four. So whatever. Let's roll the dice and give it a go there. Great year for the quarters too. Hofstra and Annapolis. Those are, at least for me, Terry. Anyway, those are both extremely high up there on the places that know how to host that thing.
Vintage, for sure. I mean, if the right matchups come to roost, I wouldn't be surprised if Navy once again put in a good bid to challenge that 17,000 fans that they had in 2009 when Navy actually played Johns Hopkins and Maryland played Virginia in the other one. And that would certainly be a great day for lacrosse, no doubt.
Yeah, Syracuse was there in 2015, lost to Hopkins when there was, I think, 15-ish thousand fans there. It was just a terrible loss, but it was a spectacular day of lacrosse down there. Okay, Terry. You mentioned C.J. Kirst earlier when talking about Cornell. Is he clearly the best player in the country? Is there anyone else you can even argue for at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to put down anybody else, be it the Chris Kavanaughs or Sam Kings, that I kind of already mentioned. And that's before you get into the other positions. Certainly this is a sport where the star power tends to aggregate around attack. And I don't want to give short shift to Jackson Eicher, who has been the most productive player aside from ZJ in college lacrosse and just scored an overtime game winner to give his team a star against Navy and Annapolis. So there are contenders for the crown, but the answer is no. He's the best player in the sport, and there's very little argument against it. And what's so compelling about that conversation is how few people are willing to take up that side. And I think it's a reflection not just on how hard he is to play against and how productive he's been consistently over the course of his career, but also just how well liked and respected he is as an individual. And I think it's a really special combination of a lot of factors.
Yeah, it certainly is. Family's been in the game for a long time. Many brothers, including Cole, who popped through here, and they've all had great success. I look at this sort of goes into what you mentioned earlier, Terry Foy of Inside Lacrosse is with us, that, this year, the amount of teams and how strength of schedule and RPI aren't necessarily equaling up. I feel in a lot of recent years, it was pretty obvious, right, like who the best league was. Like there was that year a couple of years ago where the Ivy League went crazy, and the ACC has had its big years, and the Big Ten has had its big years. Like, is there a best conference in the country to you this year, or is that part of the reason it is so muddled this year that it's all kind of even right now?
No, it is the reason, I think. I think that if you're looking for something that's differentiated this year relative to prior years, it's that whether it's the Big East or the Patriot League, the gap between those top three leagues and the others it's way wider than it usually is. But you can spin or answer the question that you just asked me any number of ways. On an RPI basis, the Big Ten is the best league, but they're out of conference wins and losses record is 35-13. The ACC's is 32-13. So that's a relatively negligible difference. Whereas, I think you could make a pretty strong argument that while Maryland is still the presumptive number one overall seed, largely because of their win over Princeton, Cornell and Princeton are probably the presumptive 2 and 3 seeds, depending on how you value Penn State's win over Cornell. And so, if you've got the second and third best team in the country, that's a pretty rightful claim for being the best league, especially when, the team that for, kind of historically had weighed down the metrics in Dartmouth is not that team this season. And so, again, I think if you're a fan of a Big Ten, ACC, or Ivy League team, you've got some solid footing to make an argument that your conference is the best.
All right. How do you think the ACC plays out going forward? The Orange still have Duke and Carolina to go. Virginia's obviously struggling a little bit currently compared to their standards. How do you think this league finishes up things?
Yeah, well, so it's a 14 conference tournament, so the fifth place finisher misses, and I think that it's way more likely than not that ends up being the Cavaliers, as they've got the Blue Devils, who have been their bugaboo, left. And so I think that it really does come down to just kind of the seeding, and right now North Carolina has the leg up, but they've got Notre Dame coming to town, and that is one of the Notre Dame, Carolina, and Syracuse, Carolina are probably two of the under the radar rivalry games where you can tell that there's some bad blood historically.
Oh, there's some bad blood with Carolina and Syracuse. There have been some, some vicious games between those two.
But you would agree, right? If I were to ask,
100%.
like, hey, list their rivals in order. You talk about Hopkins, you talk about Cornell, you talk about Hobart, Army, even more so, right? So yeah, I think that, like I said, I feel like it's a little bit under the radar, and so I think you got some great games left, and there's still enough of you can kind of shake the snow globe and see seeds 1, 2, 3, 4 falling in a bunch of different orders. Such that I wouldn't feel comfortable making a prediction outside of the fact that I don't think Duke's going to get a top 2 seed. I think it's likely Virginia's going to miss the tournament. And if I were betting, I would say Carolina's going to be the 1 seed, and Notre Dame, Syracuse are going to, if not play in the semifinals, then that's actually what I would bet. I think that's probably how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, and regardless of a combination of those teams, no matter how you shake it out, it's going to be excellent matchups when we get down to that in a few weeks. All right, Terry, always great to catch up. I'm sure we'll check in again as we get deeper into tournament time, but thanks so much for hopping on.
Thanks so much, Brian. Right. Always enjoy. I appreciate you having me.
Our guy Terry Foy, the CEO of Inside Lacrosse. Yes, it's snowing, or it was snowing. I refuse to look outside the window. I don't want to know. Ignorant.